Hello, welcome back to another Stardust tutorial. Today I wanted to talk about a specific technique using splines that I've been using in some recent projects for creating kind of like holographic UI effects. Um, while this specific example that I'm showing right now is kind of like a layering of a lot of different kind of techniques, one of the things that I have found helpful in calling out like discrete or specific parts of a model. In this instance, I'm drawing on these splines that are following the actual profile of the Coke can moving up. And then also I have them around the top kind of lid and tab piece, but those are kind of harder to see because of kind of how additive everything is. But if I jump into this project real quick, we can look at them isolated on black. You can see the specific elements I'm talking about. So in the beginning of it, they kind of trace around the top and they draw down the sides. This technique is using splines, like I said, and I feel like there's something that a lot of people don't use that often. And I think they're pretty exquisite for these perfect kind of direct examples. Before I jump into the technique, I wanted to show some other examples of how I've been using this. And then I also just want to kind of give a top level overview of the splines just so we can kind of understand what's happening, why this approach works, and how you can maybe use this in your projects. So let's jump into a new scene. First, usually, like I think when you want to draw something on, we normally just think mask. And there's a lot of options in After Effects to do mask now. So you could do, I have like a shape layers, there's 3D stroke, you can do mask with Stardust, and they all pretty much, and there's also Saber, they all pretty much do the same thing, except maybe how they're interpreting in 3D space is a little different. This is great when you have something that's like kind of flat. I feel like if you wanted to do something in space, like if this was a traveling shot, kind of like in our comp here, if I turn back on our footage at the bottom down here, or if I just go into it, since our scene is moving, if you have a mask, you can place it in like Z space, and I think that would work. But say if there was a person running along here and you wanted to trail with them, you kind of want something that's more organic and you want control of it. So you want it like moving in space with your camera. So let's jump into a new scene and look at creating splines, and let's just kind of talk about some of the top lines of why they're kind of unique for the setup and what's cool about them. So first, let's make some point lights, because that's what we're going to use to create our lights. So, or I mean our spline, sorry. I'm going to start this at 0, 0, and I did Z as my naming convention. And I'm going to duplicate this along the X here. And then let's look at our Stardust layer. I just applied the effect, and this is kind of the default setup. So we're going to change our type to spline. And we're going to do once, and we're going to set our speed to 0. And then you can see that now we have a line being drawn between our points. And what Stardust is doing is kind of creating a Bezier interpolation between these positional data points. And let's say that was cool, but you wanted something that was a little bit more defined. You could kind of duplicate the lights, and the tighter they are together, the more defined that curve point is going to be. So if you had like say a typography that you're drawing on or something, this you would just kind of space them out appropriately to get the right curve there. What's also nice is if you're not trying to go for something curvy, if you go to the intensity on the light, right now it's set to 100. If we set this to 200, it gets a bit more linear. And then if we go to 300, it's very linear and hard edges. So that's cool. Our points are in space. These could be attached to nulls. These could be, moving throughout your scene. They're in your camera move, they're locked in. That's pretty rad. Now we just kind of need to look at the controls that we have for animating them, the aesthetic of them. So first off, most of your properties are under the path properties here. So if we increase our samples, if I set this to say 500 at this size, we'll start to get a really smooth line. Now, usually what you want to do is taper this. So under your particle, you have path properties. And now, since we have a path, you can start controlling these with these graphs. So let's say we wanted a kind of like fade in, fade out on our stroke here. So now it tapers really fine, it goes to 100, then tapers at the end again. So let's drag this out a little bit more. And then you can kind of start to see where this is breaking up a little bit, right? Because our particle size here is good, but down here, it's, you know, when it gets smaller, you can start to see that our samples are low. So if we set this back up to, let's say like 1,000, now you have a lot of definition there, and it keeps it throughout the stroke. So that's cool. What about color? We could also do color. So if you go to your particle properties, you could do, you know, mix life and path. And if we go to color here and change this, let's say to these like pinks, you wouldn't see anything immediately, but if you troll down this color mix path and life, at the top is the color of the life of the particles, which is drawn from this gradient. So if this was blues, you would see that they would be, you know, over their life, change their color. What we want is to use this graph, so let's just drag this to 0. And now our particles are getting the color from this over the path. What you do notice is that it's kind of reversed right now because it is dependent upon the layer order. So if we grab these and cut and paste from the bottom up, it'll paste them in reverse order. And now our gradient will match what we're seeing over here, which is dark to light, dark to light. So that's cool. What about if this was animating on or something? You would want that to kind of draw on. Up here we have some path trim options. So what we have is, you know, parameters that you could animate. Here's trim from the end and trim from the beginning. And there is an offset. So say this was, let's say 20 from that side and 40 from that side. You could animate this offset. What I will say is this value is 0 to 1. So if we set this to 0.5, you'll see that now it went from being in the middle to being on the ends. So just be careful with that value there, but that is a cool way to have your strokes animate along that path. What you could do too is you notice that as it's offsetting through it, that size over life is kind of holding exactly to where that is. Well, if we, let's say we animate this along, and we wanted that to kind of move with it, you could link this offset down here to that offset, and that would get you that effect. What's happening is, if I set this back to, let's say, 0, 0, 0, and I set this to 0.5, you'll see that same kind of effect where now our end and start are 100 and our middle is 0, kind of the opposite of our graph here. So by linking those two, you could create a nice animation where it stays kind of tapered along the path. The last thing I will show, because it's something else that we use, is kind of animating along that path. So there's two ways you could do that. I'm going to set, let's say, this back to default, and let's give it some speed along the path. Let's just say like 50 with some variation. And let's actually just, I think that should work. So now our particles are moving along the path. But what we would probably like is for them to start on one side and animate along our path. So using this emit range, it's pretty cool that you can kind of control where you're actually starting the particles and kind of having them move along the path. So if we set this to 1, we're going to only start over here, and now you'll see those particles emit and move along the trail. And we get a pretty cool animation. We could randomize our gradient colors here and randomize our speed, which it is. I think if we lowered our samples, maybe, there you go, kind of get a more easier to see animation. So you can see here, you can play with a lot of variables and get like a lot of interesting things. And again, this is just talking about the spline attributes. You know, this is Stardust, so you could replicate this. You could add turbulence. You could emit auxiliary particles from it. There's like a million things you could do with this, and that's all cool all on its own. But I'm just trying to give like the surface kind of like overview of like what are splines inside of Stardust and why are we using them. So I just want to say this is also using splines. So you can do a lot of crazy things with them. This is, you know, taking a model and adding a deformer, and you can deform using a spline. So I have the same kind of setup in here where I have lights and they're animating, and Stardust is drawing a line, or it's actually creating geometry that's being bent and deformed along that with some turbulence. So there's a lot of like crazy things you can do with splines, but I do digress. That is something totally off the wall. So what I would like to show is just some kind of like concrete examples of how I've been using this and like why I think it's an interesting technique. You know, being able to take these kind of different elements. I want to draw a wireframe, and I also want to draw, you know, rings and curves and things based on mask, and I want to emit particles. Like all of those like together in harmony is kind of what sells a really nice effect. So looking at a couple examples from recent projects, I kind of fly through these because they're all doing the same thing, but let's look at the version of this that's on black. This, you know, set of toothbrushes we're animating on. They kind of had this cool like birthing animation from the bottom up, but we wanted to draw on these like very specific profiles from the geometry, and they kind of like initiated like the wireframe before the rest of the wireframe drew on. So these are the kind of like the spline portion of this animation. On this Hoover project that I worked on, I kind of used splines all across this project, again in conjunction with different techniques. But you know, like one was here, we needed these lines that were, you know, points from moving along it in Z space, you know, kind of in this camera move. And what specifically needed to happen was that there was this dip from the carpet to the wood floor. And, you know, creating this, you know, I was able to have a lot of control with like how tight I was bringing in splines and able to give it this kind of feeling of like changing in height. Then I was able to kind of mask it out using a field in Stardust and create this kind of like step. And these are things that like go by really fast, but it was a creative approach to it that I thought I was able to have a lot of control over it. And then the other usage was kind of like drawing these profile lines across all of the geometry that matched from 3D. This is all in Maya, so bringing in locators from Maya, having it all sit in the right camera space and match the profiles of everything, and being able to kind of like animate things on and off with control was really important. So I think it was like really successful, you know, usage on this project. And then here's some nulls. You can see all of my lights that I've broken into different colors so that I could do this like create splines per grouping of lights. So that worked. That was cool. Same thing. And then the other example was this recent project was a golf club. And you can see in this shot here, drawing on the letter forms with splines, and then also tracing around the perimeter of different pieces of geometry, and then also these speed lines that are moving. Let me see if I can RAM preview just a portion of that. We don't need to hear it. and you can kind of see what's happening. Again, like this is stuff that is very layered in. It's a very layered effect, but I think it kind of overall helps the aesthetic. Like drawing these perimeter lines aren't that noticeable, but without them, you know, you can kind of, I don't know, there's just something that works. And the speed lines, you know, using that kind of path trim and offset, I was able to kind of create this loop that really gave a sense of wind or air moving across the surface. So that worked really well. Is there another example of that? Oh, and here, there's some parts of the club that we're drawing on here. Let's see if I can ramp preview that too. And then same thing, you know, just able to grab edges from the geometry from 3D, bring them in, and they all matched and lined up. It gave a nice sense of control and ability to kind of put lines like specifically where I wanted them in the camera move and with depth of field and everything, and I think it worked out. So that's kind of the approach that I took to this can shot. So let's jump into that and talk about the workflow that I did on that. All right, so before we jump into the project and talk about it, there are a few plugins and scripts that I'm using that make this possible. I mean, some of them are just for like making the workflow quicker, faster, and one is necessary. In this case, I'm using Maya because that's been software of choice on the past few projects, all the ones that I was showing there. Since I'm going back and forth with Maya, the extension that I'm using is called Autodesk Maya Live Link, which if we jump over here, so this is a tool that works with Adobe and Maya, and it passes locators and cameras back and forth between Maya and After Effects. It works really great. What's nice about it is, as I get into it, I can show you, but there is under advanced here, there's a scale, which is nice to be able to control the actual positional data as it's coming into After Effects, just to kind of scale everything down or up so that your values remain in a good range. The other tool that I'm using is Null Swapper. So when I bring those locators in from Maya, they're coming in as locators, and I'm swapping them to point lights. So this is a great tool for automating that process, which I probably is recommended if you're going to do this approach from Maya. And then the other thing that I'm using is an older script, but it's called Selected Layers Renamer. So this is nice because then I can select those groups of lights and rename them to create, you know, a specific grouping of the splines. So I will link these in the description, but these are what I'm using to kind of automate this process. So now, what is that process, right? So let's jump into Maya real quick and we'll look at it. So here I have my scene and I have this can, like I said, and I knew what I specifically wanted was to create outlines that match the geometry. So if I select these locators, you can see that I have this group, which is starting at the bottom, and they kind of follow the profile up. They come up to the top, and then they wrap around this kind of lip, and then in there. And then I have a second group, which is the circumference of the top here. It's basically a circle, right? But I want it to match, so I kind of evenly spaced locators along a spline. And then I also went ahead and did the inside of this mouth tab. So let's say we're going to create a new edge to bring into After Effects just so we can see this process. So let's do one thing. First is, before I do that, I think I have a new scene here, which is called the Can Comp with no lines, which it has everything else in here except for those splines. That's going to help us. Great. So what we want to do is minimize that. And I actually want to launch under File, Adobe After Effects Live Link in here. so that it's linking to my After Effects comp, and it actually tells you which comp that it's connected to. It says can comp no splines, and under advanced, I'm going to set this to 10. This is just the 1:10 ratio that I've found that works well for me. So now what I would need to do is create some locators. So this is a high res mesh, so I'm going to hide that. We're going to show my other mesh, which is getting subdivided at render time, but it's, you know, approximation, and this works fine. So let's say we're going to do this, right? So what I would want to do is go into edge. So I'm going to select the edge I want and go to modify, convert, and we're going to do edge to polygon, edge to curve. And then now that we have that, I'm going to name that. We're going to call this our tab. And then I'm going to create a new locator, create locator. And I'm going to name this. Let's say this is going to be F. We'll do 0, 0. And we'll find our locator. It is at our scene origin, which is way over there. So I'm going to snap that to over here, frame it up. And now it's near our curve. So I'm going to select both of those and isolate down. And now I can snap this to the curve. And so now I'll just duplicate this. And remember, it's kind of going to create Bezier interpolation. So you just want to think about how that point is going to be drawing. So this is a tight curve and I want it to match. So maybe I create, you know, a bit more points there. And then I move it along, same thing, and just kind of go through this process. So it's a bit tedious, but again, we're doing this tedious part so that it's kind of more automated inside of After Effects. Same thing, end it there. Everything looks good. Great. So now we have all of our locators. We can go back to our live link. We can just drag these in. And it's going to ask, would you like to override the composition's preferences? We're going to say no. Because we're just getting data. Go back to over here, and we'll see that we now have, I'm just going to close this because we're done using that. Now we'll see that we have all of our locators have come in, and they're all at the top of our can. Perfect. Now let's run those couple of scripts that I mentioned. So we're going to go to File, Scripts, and the first one that we're going to do is our null swapper. I'm just going to hit swap. It's going to go through, grab all those and swap them out. Great. And the next thing I want to do is rename them. You know, having the Maya and the pipe in front of it is just kind of cumbersome. I just want them to be just the letter and the number. So we're going to go to Scripts, Recent Scripts, and also Selected Layer Renamer. This is version 1.1. I'm going to do number. And so let's say we want these to be F underscore, and then count by 1 is fine. Hit OK. And then now all of our lights are now named F. So now we can go ahead and turn those off. We don't need to look at them. And let's create a new emitter and a particle. And let's set our emitter type to, let's select everything, hide it. Let's name these. So we're going to call this our spline F. And this is our, let's call this PO. I don't know, what are we up to here? Just do 7. Great. Let's do a same thing we did before. Let's set this to spline. We'll do default. We'll do our speed to 0. And let's do a long path 25. And let's turn on our Stardust layer. And let's go ahead and hide all of this, so we can just focus on that. So now you can see that we have our particles. They're in space. They're matching our 3D scene. And you know, we're pretty close to it. All we gotta do is just dial in the look of them. So let's change their particle size to maybe like 1. let's look at so what we did is we technically have the lights in our scene. So what we want to do is this starting with, we want to set this to the letter. So we have F underscore, and now it's only going to look at our lights. So you'll notice here that it stops at the last light. So one thing I like to do is just copy the last light and put that at the top. And then now it's creating a perfect loop. So great. Let's just maybe change their color. Maybe they're going to be a random from gradient. And maybe we're doing, some purples. Since we're doing something that's additive, it's nice to have different values. So let's do some really dark purple, some really dark blue purple, and then we can get in some lighter values, and then some really hot colors, maybe something like that. And then if I turn off my can here, you can see that now we have these particles that are moving along our path, and they're in our scene, and it's looking pretty cool, like without that much work. Now, the work that I did before just bringing in new locators was that, I did the same process to bring in the camera, and that was pretty much it. I had a scene where I was creating assets, and now we have our locators that are brought into our scene, and they match, and we can start like dialing in the look. And that is kind of how the process that I went about in creating, if we jump back over to our can comp. But then you can see like, okay, cool. We brought in some splines, that profile path that was going up, the one that was going around the top, and then we kind of have one around the mouth hole there. And they're all drawing on using, kind of the trim path, and then they have speed along path. They have color along path. So it's kind of like something that, again, is really simple, but controllable, predictable, and you can kind of do it so fast. I mean, you saw how quickly I brought in that data from Maya. If anything were to change from, the scene, let's say this was like an actual shot, and there was another camera change, you could just drag your camera into here, bring it over into After Effects, and then you're back. You don't have to change too much. I mean, this would work with Cinema or whatever 3D program you're in. Bringing in points and information is really simple. So the one thing that I will say, like I said, with Maya was adjusting the scale. And that's specifically because if your values get too big, you can kind of see up here at the top, there is a render settings. It's kind of jumping the ship here, but clipping. So, you kind of look at these values. These are the default values. You can increase these. So this could be, like 45,000 and 64,000. But your scene size in pixels is all represented by this point size, and everything, your origin XYZ, all that stuff, to keep these in manageable values. I do that to bring them all down, because like if I didn't, then they might be really high values. So like, let's look at those F lights that I just brought in, that I closed. I know I'm going off script here a little bit, but hear me out. So by doing 1 to 10 ratio, those values come in like, this is 41, that's 1700, and that's 4000. Those are very manageable values. That's really important when you're, working with big scenes or big assets, and you're going to hit a ceiling on something. So say like transform position, say you were adding in a transform to affect the, I don't know, like here I'm linking it to a null so that it's at the center of my scene to match in Maya. Well, these have limits, like this value, if I break this doesn't go above 10,000, I don't think. Am I a liar? This doesn't go above 50,000. So if you didn't scale down your scene and you had a value, say that you were trying to match in Z-Space at 55, thousand, then all of a sudden you start running into these like bigger problems. So this is things that you learn as you're working with values. But you know, things like scene scale matter a lot. So when you're working in Cinema, I think Cinema works at a much more manageable scene scale. But if you're working in Maya projects and you're working with the 3D team, you're not going to have them change their values to accommodate you. You're going to have to adapt to them. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I do digress. That is kind of getting into the nitty gritty apart from the technique. But I wouldn't want you trying to do the technique, getting upset at and not understanding why it wasn't working, or, you know, exactly how it wasn't working. But you just kind of have to, you know, do this troubleshooting that I've had to do on all of these projects. None of them are really easy, but once you kind of create a system and it works, then you can kind of translate it and populate it across multiple shots, and it helps you, and it also helps your team out and your creative director if you're going to sit down and, you know, change the speed of how they're moving around it, or what time they animate on, or the color of them, those kind of things. It gives you more time to dial that stuff in rather than getting caught up in, like, you know, really complicated stuff. And I think these are the types of paths that are not easily to translate to be able to draw on in space. So I think this is a great specific technique for this kind of like holographic UI look, but also, like I said, with the other example of like the really crazy, like low polygon looking thing, you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. So, you know, just play with it, explore, and see what you come up with. But I hope that this helps you in doing this type of effect, if that's what you're doing. It's fun. I like that I've figured out a way to get data in really easy and have control over it. And I think that's usually the kind of trick to stuff like this, is how much creative control do you have over it once you've nailed the look. So yeah, that's my rant. I hope that helps. And if you have any questions, hit me in the comments. Thanks for watching. I know it's a little bit longer, but I tend to do long videos. Hopefully I didn't skimp over too many details.